Savannah, Georgia, spring 1873, 8 years after the Civil War ended slavery, but not everything died with it. Jonathan Whitaker grabbed the man by the throat, slammed him against the wall, and pressed a blade to his jaw. "You tell anyone what you saw," he whispered, "and I will bury your whole family before Sunday." Then he turned to his men and said 4 words that stopped every heartbeat in that room. "Find the Carter girl." If this story shook you to your core, please subscribe to our channel and follow Emma's story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Mary Carter had always known her daughter was different. Not different the way some mothers mean it, when they say it with a soft smile and a proud little laugh. Different the way that keeps you up at night. Different the way that makes you pray a little harder before you close your eyes. Emma was 11 years old in the spring of 1873, and she had never once in her life said anything she did not mean. That was the first thing people noticed. Other children told small lies the way they breathed, naturally, without thinking. Emma did not. She couldn't. Not because she was unusually honest, but because her mind operated on a kind of ruthless logic that simply had no room for fiction. "Mama," Emma said one morning, not looking up from her notebook, "you're going to burn the bread." Mary turned around to check. The bread was fine. 3 minutes later, the bread was burnt. Mary stood there, holding the pan, staring at her daughter, and Emma had already moved on, her pencil scratching steadily across the page. Thomas Carter, Emma's father, worked the docks down near the Savannah River. He was a quiet man, broad-shouldered, careful with his words, the way poor men learn to be careful. He loved his daughter fiercely and completely. But there were moments, more and more of them lately, when he looked at Emma and felt something cold settle in the pit of his stomach. "She's just sharp," he told Mary whenever she brought it up. "Girl's got a sharp mind, nothing wrong with that." "Thomas," Mary said one night, her voice low, "she told Mrs. Beaumont's boy that his father wasn't coming home from his fishing trip. She said it plain as weather. 'Your daddy won't be back.' And the boy laughed at her. And then, 'I know what happened,' Thomas said. They didn't talk about it after that. What had happened was this. Robert Beaumont had gone out on his boat on a Tuesday morning, same as always, and had not returned. They found the boat 3 days later, drifting near Tybee Island. Robert Beaumont was never found. His wife wept for 6 months. His son did not speak to Emma Carter for the rest of that year. But here was the thing that Mary and Thomas never said out loud, because saying it out loud made it real in a way that terrified them both. Emma had told the boy on Monday, before his father left. The Savannah that Emma Carter lived in was not the Savannah of the grand houses and the Spanish moss and the church bells on Sunday morning. That Savannah existed. She had seen it from a distance. But the Savannah Emma knew was the Savannah of the waterfront, where the air smelled of salt and tar and something older and darker underneath both. It was the Savannah of cramped wooden houses where families of 6 shared 2 rooms. It was the Savannah where, just 8 years earlier, men and women had been bought and sold on the same streets where free men now walked. The war had ended slavery on paper, but the South had a long and practiced habit of keeping things alive that were supposed to be dead. Emma sat at her window for hours every day. That was her habit, her ritual, the thing that the other children on the block had long since stopped asking her to explain. She sat with her notebook open in her lap, and she watched. She watched Mr. Halverson leaves for work at 7 minutes past 6 every morning and come home at 5 minutes to 8 every evening, except on Thursdays, when he came home 2 hours late and smelled different. She watched the way Mrs. O'Brien touched her left wrist whenever she lied, which was more often than Mrs. O'Brien would have liked anyone to know. She watched the men from the loading dock walk past in groups of 3, then 2, then 1, as the weeks grew warmer. and she understood without being told that the one who still walked alone was the one who had lost his job and hadn't told his wife yet. "Why do you write all that down?" her friend Nora asked her once. Nora was 12, gap-toothed, practical in the way that children who have grown up poor tend to be practical. "So I don't forget," Emma said. "Forget what?" "The pattern." Nora looked at the notebook. It was dense with numbers, initials, times, notes that made no sense unless you had been sitting at that window for as long as Emma had. "What pattern?" "People think they're hiding," Emma said, "but they always do the same things. Everybody does. And when somebody's about to do something," she paused, "the pattern changes." Nora didn't know what to say to that. She went home shortly after and told her mother Emma Carter was strange. Her mother agreed. Emma did not mind being called strange. She had been called strange her whole life. What she minded was being ignored. It was a Wednesday in April when it happened, the day that changed everything. Emma had been watching Henry Dalton for 11 weeks. Dalton was a heavy man, 63 years old, florid-faced, who had owned a lumber operation on the west side of town since before the war. He had also, before the war, owned people. That was known. Nobody said it plainly, but it was known the way a lot of things were known in Savannah. The way a stone at the bottom of a clear river is known, visible but untouched. What Emma had noticed about Dalton was not his past. She was 11. She did not fully understand his past. What she had noticed was a change in his pattern over the last 3 weeks. He had begun arriving at his mill 30 minutes later than usual. His left hand had a tremor he was trying to hide by keeping it in his coat pocket. On 2 separate occasions, she had watched him stop walking mid-stride, press his hand to his chest, and stand very still for several seconds before continuing. On the morning of Wednesday, April 16th, Emma put down her pencil and said to her mother, "Mama, Mr. Dalton is going to die today. It'll be in the afternoon, around 2 o'clock. Mary Carter stopped washing the dishes. She turned around very slowly. "Emma, don't say things like that." "I'm not saying it to be mean," Emma said. "I'm saying it because it's true." "How could you possibly know that?" "His hand shakes. He keeps stopping to press on his chest. He's been coming in late because the walk is getting hard for him. Something's wrong with his heart. Has been for a while." She paused. "He looked at his grandson yesterday on the street, and he looked at him like he was saying goodbye. People only look at children that way when they know they won't see them again." Mary stared at her daughter. Emma picked her pencil back up and went back to her notebook. At 2:14 in the afternoon, Henry Dalton collapsed in his lumber mill. He was dead before they got him outside. By nightfall, the entire neighborhood knew what Emma Carter had said that morning. By the following morning, the story had grown. It had grown the way stories grow in small, frightened communities, which is to say, it had grown in the direction of whatever people most needed to believe. Some said Emma had made it happen. Some said she had seen it in a dream. Some said she was touched by God. Some said she was touched by the devil. A preacher 2 streets over gave a sermon that didn't mention Emma by name, but that everyone understood was about her, warning about children who spoke prophecy without the sanction of the church. Thomas Carter heard about the sermon and said nothing. Mary Carter heard about the sermon and doubled the length of her prayers that night. Emma heard about the sermon and wrote down the time it ended in her notebook, because the preacher's pattern had also changed recently, and she was starting to understand why. "You need to stop telling people what you see," Thomas told her that night. His voice was not angry. It was frightened, which was worse. "I didn't tell people," Emma said. "I told Mama." "It's the same thing. Is it wrong to tell the truth?" Thomas sat down across from his daughter. He was a man who had spent his whole life being careful, saying less than he thought, staying small so that the world would leave him alone. It had worked, more or less. But looking at Emma now, At the absolute steady calm in her dark eyes, he understood for the first time that his daughter could not be small. Her mind was not built for it. "It's not about right or wrong," he said finally. "It's about safe." Emma looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back down at her notebook. "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I'm watching." What Thomas did not know, what nobody knew yet, was that Emma's notebook now had 42 names in it. 42 men whose patterns she had been studying, in some cases for nearly 2 years. 42 sets of numbers, roots, times, habits, and changes. 42 stories being written in the margins of the one everyone could see. And one name near the top of the list, underlined twice. Jonathan Whitaker. Emma had been watching him longest of all. And what his pattern was telling her was not the kind of thing she could share with her mother. Not yet. Because what his pattern was telling her was something so large and so terrible that she needed more time to be certain. She was not the kind of girl who made mistakes, but she was the kind of girl who knew, bone deep, when something was coming. And something was coming. Emma did not sleep that night. Not because she was afraid. Fear was something Emma understood the way she understood most things, as a pattern, a predictable response to a specific kind of information. What kept her awake was something else entirely. It was the weight of what she had written on page 47 of her notebook. 47 pages of names, times, roots, and numbers. And now, circled 3 times in the corner of that page, a single number that she had calculated and recalculated until there was no more room for doubt. 23. 23 people who had disappeared from Savannah in the last 2 years and had never come back. She lay in the dark and listened to her parents breathing in the next room, and she counted the gaps between their breaths, the way other children counted sheep. And she thought about the number 23 until the shapes of it settled into something solid and undeniable in her mind. They weren't runaways. They weren't people who had simply moved on. The disappearances followed a pattern too specific, too deliberate to be anything but engineered. Always men and women between 20 and 40 years old. Always from families with no powerful connections, no one to ask loud questions. Always within 3 weeks of a Wednesday night meeting that took place in the back room of a warehouse on Oglethorpe Street. Emma had documented 11 of those meetings. She had never been close enough to hear what was said inside. She hadn't needed to be. The pattern told her everything. The morning came gray and damp, and Emma was already at her window before her mother woke up. Nora came by just after 8, the way she usually did, and knocked twice on the doorframe because the door was always open in warm weather. "You look terrible," Nora said, settling onto the floor beside Emma's chair. "I didn't sleep. Because of what happened with Mr. Dalton?" Emma shook her head slowly, her eyes still on the street. "Because of what I found in the numbers." Nora looked at the notebook in Emma's lap. She had long since stopped trying to read it. The numbers made her head hurt. "What did you find?" Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very carefully, "Do you know what happened to the Johnson family? The ones who lived on Price Street?" Nora frowned. "They moved away. Everybody said they moved to Charleston." "Nobody moves to Charleston in the middle of February without packing their things," Emma said. "Their furniture was still in the house. I watched the house for 2 weeks after they disappeared. Nobody came to collect it. Nobody wrote to the landlord. Nobody who moves says goodbye the way the mother said goodbye to her neighbor. She held her hand for a long time, like she knew she wasn't coming back." Nora stared at her. "Emma, what are you saying?" "I'm saying the Johnsons didn't move to Charleston." The silence between them stretched out long and uncomfortable. Outside, a cart horse clopped slowly down the street. "You need to tell your father," Nora said finally. "I know," Emma said. I'm still calculating. Calculating what? How much danger it puts him in when I do. Nora went home 20 minutes later, and she walked faster than usual. Thomas Carter came home from the docks that evening with a bruise along his jaw that he tried to hide by keeping his face turned slightly to the left. Mary saw it immediately. Emma saw it before he even walked through the door. "Who hit you?" Mary said. "Fell on the dock." "Thomas." "I fell," he said, and his voice closed the subject the way a door closes, firmly, with no invitation to knock again. Emma watched her father eat his supper in silence. She watched the way he held his fork with his right hand and kept his left hand flat on the table, pressing down, like he was trying to keep something underneath it from rising. She watched the way he chewed without tasting. She had seen that before, in men who had received a warning and were deciding how seriously to take it. "Papa," she said. He looked up. "Did someone talk to you today? About me?" Thomas put his fork down. He looked at his wife. Mary looked at her hands.
"Finish your supper, Emma," he said.
"I need to know if—"
"Finish your supper." She finished her supper, but she wrote down the time and the expression on his face, and she added it to page 47, and the number that had been 48% certainty became 63. They knew she was watching. 2 days later, Emma saw the man for the first time. He was standing at the end of the block, leaning against a post, doing the thing that men who are trying not to look obvious always do, which is to look obviously at everything except what they're actually watching. Emma had been aware of him for about 4 minutes before she picked up her pencil. She wrote down his physical description, his posture, the direction his shoes were pointing, the fact that he had been there for at least 40 minutes based on when she had last looked at that stretch of street. He was watching their house. Emma did not tell her mother. She added his description to her notebook under a new category she labeled simply Watchers. By the end of the week, there were 3 names under that heading. The following Wednesday night, Emma did something she had never done before. She left the house after midnight. She had planned it carefully. She knew exactly when her parents fell into their deepest sleep based on 2 months of observation. She knew the 3rd floorboard from the bottom of the stairs made a sound, and she stepped over it. She moved through the dark neighborhood with the kind of absolute quiet that comes not from training, but from total concentration. And she made her way to Oglethorpe Street, keeping to the shadows, staying far enough back to be invisible. The warehouse was lit from the inside. She could hear voices, but not words. She was too far away. She moved closer, inch by inch, and crouched behind a stack of empty crates, and she stayed there for an hour and 40 minutes without moving, listening. And what she heard rearranged everything she thought she understood about the world she lived in. "We've got a buyer in Louisiana. He wants field workers, not house people. So don't bring me anyone who looks like they haven't worked a day in their life." A second voice, lower, careful. "What about the Freeman boy? He's been asking questions about his brother. Deal with it." "And the girl?" There was a pause that lasted exactly 4 seconds. Emma counted them. "Which girl?" "The Carter child, the one who's been making all those predictions." Another pause, longer this time. "She's 11 years old," said a third voice, and Emma recognized it immediately because she had been studying its owner for longer than any of the others. Jonathan Whitaker. "But clever girls can be dangerous, especially clever girls who sit at windows and write things down." His voice was perfectly calm. That was what made it terrifying. "How much does she know?" "We don't know what she knows. That's the problem."
"Then we find out," Whitaker said. "Start with the father. Men will say anything when they're scared enough for their children." Emma pressed herself against the crates and breathed through her nose and did not move.
She stayed until the voices stopped and the lights went out and the men left one by one. She recognized 4 of them by their walks. She had their walks in her notebook.
She went home the same way she came, over the third stair from the bottom, and she sat at her desk in the dark, and she opened to a blank page, and she wrote for 40 minutes straight without stopping. When she was done, she read it back. Then she did the math. She wrote the number at the bottom of the page and underlined it.
84%. She stared at it for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and placed her hand flat on the cover, the same way her father had pressed his hand to the table that night at supper. And she sat there in the dark until the first gray light began to show at the edges of the window. She did not cry.
Emma Carter had not cried since she was 7 years old, the night she had told her mother that her grandmother was going to die, and her mother had told her to stop saying wicked things, and her grandmother had died the next morning. She had understood then that the world did not want what she had to give. It did not want the truth in the shape she was able to see it. It wanted the comfortable version, the version that let people sleep. Emma could not give them that. It simply was not in her. But she could give her family something better than comfort. She could give them time. She got up from her chair, walked to her parents' door, and knocked 3 times. Thomas opened it with the startled look of a man who had been sleeping lightly, which Emma had already known.
"Papa," she said, and her voice was steady as a compass needle. "I need you to sit down. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything."
Thomas looked at his daughter in the dark hallway, at the notebook under her arm, at the absolute certainty in her 11-year-old face. He sat down, and Emma Carter began to talk. Thomas Carter sat on the edge of his bed and listened to his daughter talk for 22 minutes without interrupting her once. That was not something Thomas Carter was known for. He was a man who interrupted, who corrected, who filled silence with his own voice, the way men of his generation had been taught to do, because silence meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was dangerous when you were poor and the world was not built in your favor. But something in Emma's voice that night stopped him cold. It wasn't the words, it was the precision of them. The way she spoke without trembling, without rushing, the way she laid each fact down like a card on a table and then moved to the next one without pausing to see how he was reacting. When she was done, Thomas did not speak for a long time. Mary had woken up halfway through and was sitting beside him, her hand pressed over her mouth. 23 people, Thomas said finally. "At least 23, Emma said. "Those are the ones I can confirm. There may be more before I started counting." And Whitaker is behind it. He runs it. The others follow his direction. He has 3 men who handle the collection. She said the word carefully, the way you say a word you have looked up and understand intellectually, but whose full weight you are still absorbing. They target people with no family connections, people who won't be loudly missed. Thomas stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to his family, and Emma watched the muscles in his shoulders and understood he was not looking at anything outside. He was making a decision. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I've suspected for 4 months. I became certain 11 days ago." He turned around. 11 days. "I needed to be sure before I told you. I don't tell people things I'm not sure about." Thomas looked at his daughter, and for a moment something crossed his face that was not quite pride and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them. Then he said, "Emma, these men have money and guns and half the law in Savannah in their pockets. You understand that? What they'll do to protect what they have?" "Yes," Emma said. "That's the 84%. Mary made a sound that was not quite a word. "What does that mean?" Thomas asked. Emma opened her notebook to the last page she had written. "It means that based on everything I've observed, the probability that they will attempt to harm our family within the next 72 hours is 84%. She paused. "I've been wrong before, but not often.
The room was very quiet. Then Thomas Carter said something Emma had never heard him say in her entire life. He said, "Tell me what to do." The next morning, Thomas did not go to the docks.
He sent word that he was sick, which was the first lie Thomas Carter had told his employer in 11 years of working for him. Instead, he went to see a man named Calvin Morse, a free black doctor who ran a small practice on the edge of the neighborhood. A man who had survived in Savannah for 20 years by being extremely careful and extremely smart, and keeping detailed records of everything he witnessed in his professional capacity. Thomas had known Calvin Morse for 6 years. He trusted him the way you trust a man who has proven himself quietly over a long time. He told Calvin everything Emma had told him. Calvin Morse listened without expression. Then he walked to his cabinet, took out a bottle, poured 2 glasses, and set one in front of Thomas without a word. "She's 11, Thomas said. "I know how old she is. She has 42 names in a notebook. She snuck out at midnight to listen to Whitaker's meeting and came home and calculated probabilities." Thomas picked up the glass and put it down without drinking. "Calvin, what is wrong with my child?" "Nothing is wrong with her," Calvin said. His voice was precise, measured, the voice of a man who had trained himself to remain calm in rooms where panic was contagious. "I've read about cases like this. There are men in Europe studying the brain, patterns of exceptional cognition. What Emma has is not madness. It is not supernatural. It is a mind that processes information at a speed and depth that most people cannot comprehend." He paused. "It is also, in the wrong circumstances, extraordinarily dangerous, because people who cannot understand something fear it, and people in power who fear a child will not behave rationally about her." Thomas stared at the glass. "What do I do?" "First," Calvin said, "you understand that Emma is right. I have suspected something was wrong on Oglethorpe Street for over a year. I have had patients who described disappearances that were never investigated. I have kept my own records." He stood and walked to his desk and unlocked the bottom drawer. He removed a folder and placed it on the table between them. 17 cases that I documented personally. Men and women who came to me, who were healthy, who had no reason to leave, and who vanished. He looked at Thomas steadily. "Your daughter didn't find this alone. She confirmed it. And if she confirmed it in a notebook that Whitaker's people can find..." "They're watching the house," Thomas said. "She counted 3 of them." Calvin was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "How soon can you be ready to leave?" Back on their street, Emma was sitting at her window, not watching the watchers this time, watching a different man entirely. A man who had arrived at 7 that morning and positioned himself not in the obvious place, not where the other 3 watchers had stood, but across and down, at an angle that suggested training. Deliberate placement. The way a man stands when he has done this before and knows how to do it better than amateurs. Emma wrote it down. She wrote, "New watcher, northwest angle, professional posture, arrived 7:04 a.m. She underlined professional. Then she added a new number at the bottom of the page, 91%. The 72-hour window had shortened. She could feel it, the way you feel weather changing before the clouds arrive, a pressure in the quality of the air itself. She turned from the window and went to find her mother. Mary was in the kitchen moving dishes that didn't need to be moved, which was what Mary Carter did when she was trying not to fall apart. "Mama," Emma said, "we need to pack." Mary set down the dish she was holding very carefully. "Your father isn't back yet." "I know, but we need to be ready before he gets back. The timeline has moved." She pulled her mother's hand away from the counter and held it between both of hers, which was not something Emma did often, and the unfamiliarity of it made Mary's eyes fill immediately. "Listen to me. We have time right now. We may not have time later.
So we pack now, while we have it. Emma, her mother whispered, you're 11 years old. I know, Mama.
You shouldn't have to know these things. Emma held her mother's hand tighter. But I do, she said, and right now, that's all that matters. They were still packing when Thomas came home, moving fast, Calvin Morse 2 steps behind him. Calvin had a bag over his shoulder and the look of a man who had crossed a line he had been standing near for a long time and felt, if not relief, at least the particular calm of having made an irreversible decision. Tonight, Thomas said.
Calvin knows a man with a wagon. We go tonight.
I know, Emma said. Thomas stared at her. How? Because they moved the 4th watcher to the east side of the street an hour ago. When they close the last exit point, they're getting ready to move. Standard containment. She said it completely matter-of-factly, a child describing arithmetic. We have until after dark. They won't move before dark. It creates witnesses. Calvin Morse looked at Thomas Carter with an expression that said, without words, "Now do you understand what I meant?" Thomas understood. That evening, as the sun went down over Savannah, Emma sat one last time at her window. She had lived in this house her entire life. She had watched this street for 3 years. She had filled 4 notebooks, cover to cover, with the patterns of the people who lived on it, and the people who passed through it, and the people who tried to hide what they were doing in plain sight. She opened the first notebook to the first page. She had been 8 years old when she started it. The handwriting was smaller then, more uncertain, the observations simpler. She read through it for 10 minutes. Then she closed it, put it in the bottom of her bag beneath everything else, and stood up. "I'm ready," she said. The 4th watcher was still at his post across the street. Emma looked at him one last time. She had written down everything she needed. She had left 3 separate copies of her documentation with 3 separate people, none of whom knew about the others, a precaution she had decided on at 2 in the morning 2 nights ago, when the certainty had reached the point where precautions became necessary. Jonathan Whitaker's men were watching the Carter house. What they did not know was that the Carter family had already stopped being in it. They went out through the back. Calvin led them through the narrow passage behind the row of houses, through a yard, through a gate, and to a cart waiting on the next street over, with a man sitting up front who did not ask any questions because Calvin had already paid him not to. Emma climbed up into the cart and sat between her parents and held her notebook against her chest. The cart moved. The street fell behind them. The city fell behind them. Emma did not look back. She was already calculating the next part. The cart moved north through the Georgia dark, and Emma Carter did not sleep. She sat between her parents with her notebook pressed against her chest, and she listened to the sounds of the road, and she counted the minutes the way she always counted things, not out of anxiety, but out of the deep, involuntary need her mind had to turn the world into something measurable. Thomas had his arm around Mary. Mary had her face turned into his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. The man driving the cart had not said a single word since they climbed in, and Emma had already decided she liked him for that. Words, in her experience, were most often used to cover things up rather than reveal them. Silence was more honest. They rode for 2 hours before Calvin Morse, sitting across from them in the cart bed, leaned forward and said quietly, "There's a station in Augusta. A man I know. He'll get you on a train north." "And you?" Thomas asked. Calvin looked at him steadily. "I'll follow in 3 days. I have things to finish first." "The records," Thomas said. "I didn't spend 20 years documenting what these men have done to let it disappear because I ran." His voice was flat and certain, the way a nail is certain when it is fully driven. "I have copies going to a federal contact in Washington, a man who has been waiting for documentation exactly like this." He glanced at Emma. "Like what Emma built, combined with mine." Emma looked up at him. "You had a federal contact?" "Yes." For how long? 8 months? Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You should have moved faster." Calvin almost smiled. "I know. People died while you were waiting." "Emma," Thomas said. "She's right," Calvin said simply. "She is completely right. And I will carry that." He looked out into the dark. "But we move now. That's what we can do." They reached Augusta before dawn.
The man Calvin knew was a station master who asked no questions and accepted a folded sum of money and led them through a back passage to a waiting area that was not on any official map of the station. There were 2 other families already there. A black woman with 3 children who did not make a sound. An older white man traveling alone who looked at Thomas and then looked away and kept looking away. Emma observed all of them. She wrote nothing down. For once, she simply let the information exist without cataloging it, because some things deserved to be witnessed without being turned into data. The train north left at 6:15 in the morning. Emma watched Savannah fall away behind her through the train window, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, which was grief. Not for the house, not for the neighborhood, not even for Nora, who she would probably never see again, and who had been her only friend. She felt grief for the window, for the particular quality of light on that street at 7 in the morning, for the 3 years of watching she had done from that chair, all those hours of sitting perfectly still while the world moved past her and revealed itself in its patterns and its rhythms and its terrible secrets. She had loved that window. She closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the train and let herself feel it for exactly 5 minutes. Then she opened her eyes and opened her notebook and began writing again. They arrived in Minnesota 6 days later, a small town called Northfield, where Thomas had a distant cousin who had moved north a decade earlier and who opened his door at midnight to find a family of 3 standing on his porch with 2 bags and the hollow-eyed look of people who had been running. "Come in," he said. That was all. Just come in. And it was enough. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Emma's life, which was saying something considerable. Northfield was cold in a way Savannah had never been cold, a cold that had weight and intention, that pushed against you when you walked. The people spoke differently, moved differently, looked at Thomas and Mary with curiosity rather than hostility, which was its own kind of disorienting. Emma had calibrated her entire understanding of human behavior against the specific and brutal social architecture of the post-war South. Here, the rules were different. The patterns were different. She had to start over. She did not mind. Starting over for Emma simply meant opening a new notebook. She started school in September. The teacher was a woman named Margaret Aldrich, 41 years old, who had studied at a women's college in Ohio and who recognized within Emma's first week what she was dealing with. She did not call Emma a prodigy. She did not make a spectacle of her. She simply stayed after class one afternoon and set a mathematics problem on the desk in front of Emma that was well beyond the curriculum, and watched. Emma solved it in 4 minutes. Margaret Aldrich sat down across from her and folded her hands on the desk and looked at Emma the way Calvin Morse had looked at her, which was to say directly, without the particular condescension that adults usually carried when they looked at children. "Who taught you to think like this?" she asked. "Nobody," Emma said. "I just do it." "Have you always?" "As long as I can remember." Emma paused. "Is it a problem?" "No," Margaret said, and she said it so firmly, so without hesitation, that Emma felt something shift very slightly in the architecture of her chest. "It is the opposite of a problem. It is the most remarkable thing I have seen in 20 years of teaching." She leaned forward. "I want to help you develop it, if you'll let me." Emma looked at her for a long time, the way she looked at everyone, measuring, calculating, weighing the probability of sincerity against the probability of performance. Margaret Aldrich held the look without flinching. "All right," Emma said.
What followed was the first formal education Emma Carter had ever received, and it was, by every measure she had, transformative.
Margaret brought her books from her own collection: mathematics, logic, early works on what would later be called behavioral science. She connected Emma with a professor at a nearby college, a man named Dr. Harold Vance, who specialized in what he called analytical cognition, and who had spent 15 years trying to understand why certain minds processed information in ways that defied conventional explanation. Dr. Vance met Emma on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He brought 3 tests he had designed himself. Emma completed all 3 before he had finished explaining the second one. He sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Carter, would you be willing to tell me how you did that?" "Which part?" Emma asked. "Any of it." Emma thought about it. This was unusual. Emma rarely had to think about how she did things. She simply did them. But the question of how was harder than the question of what. "I see the whole thing at once," she said finally. "Most people see problems in a line, one thing, then the next thing. I see them the way you see a room when you walk into it, all of it, at once. And then I just find where the pieces fit." Dr. Vance wrote something in his notebook. Then he looked up. "Has anyone ever suggested to you that this might be a condition of the brain? Not a flaw, a variation." "A man named Calvin Morse told my father something like that," Emma said. "Doctor—"
Morse was right. He set down his pen. "There are researchers in Europe, in France, in Germany, studying minds like yours. They don't have a name for it yet, but they're getting close." He paused. "You are not strange, Emma. You are simply operating at a frequency that most people can't hear." Emma looked at him. Something in that sentence settled into her the way true things settle, quietly, completely, without resistance. "I know," she said. "I've always known that." 3 months later, in January of 1874, the news reached Northfield through a federal bulletin that Thomas Carter read at the post office and brought home without a word and set on the kitchen table. A federal investigation had been opened into a human trafficking network operating out of Savannah, Georgia. 7 men had been arrested. 3 others had been found dead under circumstances that the bulletin described as unclear. The network was believed to be responsible for the disappearance and illegal sale of at least 31 individuals in the 2 years following the end of the Civil War. 31. Emma had calculated 23. She sat with the bulletin for a long time. Then she got out her notebook and wrote, "Final confirmed number, 31. Margin of error in original calculation, 8. Root cause, insufficient data on earlier operations. Acceptable margin." She paused with her pencil above the page. Then she wrote one more line. Calvin got the records out. She closed the notebook. Thomas was watching her from across the room. "Emma," he said, and his voice was rough in a way that voices get when a person has been holding something in for a long time. "How do you feel?" Emma thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, which was something she did not always do with emotional questions. "Like a calculation that came out right," she said. "But I don't feel good about it, because 31 people, and we only barely got out." She looked at her father. "I feel like it should have happened faster. I should have moved faster." "You're 11 years old." "I know, but they didn't know that." She meant Whitaker and his men. "They were afraid of me anyway, and they were right to be." She paused. "I think that matters." Jonathan Whitaker was arrested in March of 1874. He was tried in a federal court and convicted of conspiracy and trafficking. He was sentenced to 12 years. He served 4. That was the way of things in that time and that place, and Emma, when she learned of it years later, wrote the number in her notebook without comment,
because the calculation had never been about justice in the formal sense. It had been about stopping something. And it had stopped. Incompletely, imperfectly, in the way that most true things stop, not with a clean ending, but with a wound that scars over and leaves a mark. The last confirmed record of Emma Carter appears in a Northfield school register in the spring of 1875. She is listed as a student of exceptional ability, recommended for advanced study. There is a note in the margin in Margaret Aldrich's handwriting that reads simply, "She sees what others cannot." After that, nothing. No marriage record, no death record, no census entry. Emma Carter walked into the future, and the future kept no account of her, the way it keeps no account of most women in that time who refused to be only what their world expected them to be. But she left something behind. Calvin Morse's records, combined with the documentation that Emma had distributed to 3 separate recipients before leaving Savannah, became part of the federal evidence used in the 1874 trial. Those records are still archived in Washington. They are dry, formal, difficult reading. They list names and dates and locations. They do not mention an 11-year-old girl who sat at a window and watched and counted and calculated and understood before any adult in her world was willing to, exactly what was happening in the dark. But the numbers are there, and the numbers were hers. Thomas Carter lived until 1901, Mary Carter until 1908. Neither of them ever returned to Savannah. In the last letter Mary wrote to Calvin Morse before he died, she described Emma as having become a woman of great intelligence and great quiet. She said Emma still kept notebooks. She said Emma still sat near windows. She said that wherever Emma looked, people had the feeling she was reading something in them that they hadn't said out loud. She said Emma had never seemed to mind that no one fully understood her. She said Emma had always seemed to understand that being incomprehensible to the world was simply the price of seeing it clearly. And then the letters stopped, and the trail ended. And Emma Carter, the girl who had seen everything, passed out of the record like a figure stepping through a door and quietly closing it behind her. She left behind 4 notebooks, 1 federal investigation, 31 names restored to the record, and a question that no one in 1873 had the language to answer, and that the science of her century could not explain. What do you do with a mind that sees the truth before the world is ready to hear it? Emma Carter's answer, apparently, was simple. You write it down. You give it to the people who need it. And then you keep watching.